Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing the control of blood pressure and the control of blood volume. Okay, so we're currently in the process of discussing the baroreceptor response. Now, before we go any further with this, what I'd just like to do is make a correction to something that I said previously. So, previously, I did this summary of the baroreceptor response, and I talked about what happens when mean arterial pressure goes up, and overall what happens when mean arterial pressure goes down. Now, let me remind you what I said previously. Previously, I said that when mean arterial pressure goes up, the baroreceptor response to this was to lower sympathetic stimulation and increase parasympathetic stimulation to the heart. Now, doing those two things will overall decrease heart rate and also decrease cardiac contractility, and therefore will lower cardiac output and help to bring blood pressure down. What I didn't mention was that you also reduce the sympathetic nerve stimulation to the vascular smooth muscle cells and therefore cause vasodilatation in lots of arterioles, specifically in these sort of arterioles here, the ones to the skin, the skeletal muscle and the gastrointestinal tract, where you can change the perfusion through those areas reasonably freely, more freely than you can, for instance, to brain areas. Okay, so you're going to decrease sympathetic nervous system stimulation to the vascular smooth muscle cells around the arterioles in these tissues here, and that will cause, of course, a drop in total peripheral resistance, and that will also help to bring blood pressure down. So that's what I didn't mention, which I should have mentioned. Then I got the mean arterial pressure going down correct. I said that when mean arterial pressure goes down, you're going to raise sympathetic stimulation, lower parasympathetic stimulation to the heart, which will overall raise cardiac output, and you'll also raise sympathetic stimulation to the vascular smooth muscle cells around these arterioles in the skin, the skeletal muscle, and the gastrointestinal tract, and that will of course raise total peripheral resistance and help to bring blood pressure back up. So overall then, we can see that when mean arterial pressure goes up, and now we can think in terms of that means that the baroreceptors are going to be activated or activating action potential firing in the baroreceptive afferents more frequently, so you'll be getting more frequent action potentials up those baroreceptive afferents. That's going to lower sympathetic nervous system to both the heart and the vascular smooth muscle cells, and it's going to raise parasympathetic nervous stimulation to the heart. The parasympathetic nervous system doesn't really have an effect on the vascular smooth muscle cells. I mean, it does to an extent, but it's not really that important, so we're not going to talk about it. Far more important is sympathetic stimulation on vascular smooth muscle cells. Meanwhile, when mean arterial pressure goes too low, then of course that will be encoded in a drop in the frequency of action potentials from the baroreceptive afferents, and this is going to cause the exact opposite. We're going to raise sympathetic nervous system stimulation to the heart and to the vascular smooth muscle cells, and we're going to lower the parasympathetic stimulation to the heart. Okay, so overall, mean arterial pressure going too high is going to drop sympathetic nervous system output, and it's going to raise parasympathetic nervous system output, and mean arterial pressure going too low is going to raise sympathetic output and lower parasympathetic output. And what we now want to see is how is that actually coordinated. So how does a change in the frequency of action potentials coming in from these baroreceptive afferents actually lead to this? And it's all going to be occurring in the medulla, where there are going to be control centers for sympathetic and parasympathetic output. Okay, so we need to now then introduce this important portion of the brain, which is the medulla. So I'm not assuming that you know any neuroanatomy, so what I want to do is I want to gradually build this up. So I want to start with a picture that I'm sure you will have seen before, and show you where the medulla is on that picture. Then we'll draw a more in detail picture of the medulla, then we'll go even more in detail still, and then we'll begin to see where in the medulla there are these control centers for sympathetic nervous system output to both the vascular smooth muscle cells and also to the heart, and where there are centers that are controlling parasympathetic nervous system output to the heart. And we'll see then how the input from these baroreceptive afferents is going to affect the sympathetic and parasympathetic outputs through networks that are in the medulla. Okay, so firstly then, let's just have a look at this new portion of the brain, or potentially new portion of the brain. If you've ever studied neuroscience, you'll have heard of the medulla presumably before. Okay, but for those who aren't completely familiar with neuroanatomy, what I'm going to start by doing is drawing a picture of the brain just viewed from the left-hand side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw what the brain would look like if you just took it out of the skull and looked at it from the left-hand side. And I'm sure you've seen something like this before. Okay, so the most notable bit, the most striking bit that everyone recognizes is of course the cerebral hemisphere. So this, of course, because we're viewing from the left-hand side here, we are seeing the left cerebral hemisphere here. So I'll just colour this in yellow here, and you could also call it the left cerebrum. Means exactly the same thing. So I'll call it the cerebrum because it's just quicker than writing cerebral hemisphere. Oh, whoops! Was about to write cerebellum. Left cerebrum. So get rid of all of that bit there. Okay. What a mess. Right, so here is the left cerebrum, and I haven't even managed to colour code it properly. I'll have to concentrate more now. Okay, so this is the left cerebrum. Now, there is more that you would see, however. This is the most notable bit, of course. This is the bit that everyone recognises, but of course, if you look a bit more closely, you'll see that there is stuff poking out from underneath the left cerebral hemisphere, and I now want to look at this stuff that pokes out from underneath. So you have portions of the brainstem poking out from underneath here that will be visible, and the brainstem is just the continuation of the spinal cord after it's gone into the skull, and this is what it's going to look like. And I'll also just put the cerebellum on here, like so. Right, so here is my little picture of the central nervous system. So down here we have the spinal cord, and of course this will be within the vertebral column. So I'll just colour in the spinal cord here in green. Then when the spinal cord passes out of the vertebral column through the big hole in the base of the skull known as foramen magnum, and we talked about foramen magnum on this picture here, so we pass through foramen magnum here, then the continuation effectively of the spinal cord in the skull, that's known as the brainstem here. And the brainstem consists of three separate portions. The most inferior portion, the first portion down here, is the portion that we're really interested in. This is the medulla, and if you think about where this is going to be positioned, it's going to be positioned on this picture in this sort of position here, resting on the base of the skull here and ascending upwards. Okay, right, just to put a few more labels on this picture then, the next portion of the brainstem above the medulla is then the pons, and there is a final portion of the brainstem which we can't see on this picture, but which will be above the pons, and it's concealed by the cerebral hemispheres on this picture, so it's deep within the cerebral hemispheres, and that's going to be the midbrain. Then, to put the final thing, the final label on this picture, this is of course the cerebellum, the mini brain, very important in the motor system. It's the part that is responsible for highly coordinated movements. So when you have to make a movement that's going to be incredibly coordinated to spatial information, such as catching a ball, when you do that movement, you have to have your hands and your arms and your whole body moving in a very precise way to make sure that your hands are in the correct position to catch that ball. So movements like that, where they have to be very finely coordinated with visual information, the cerebellum's incredibly involved in doing that. Okay, so there's some basic neuroanatomy, and this is the portion we're now going to be studying further, the medulla, and you can see that where the glossopharyngeal nerves and the vagus nerves will be coming into the skull, they're going to be coming straight into the portion where the medulla is, and indeed they're going to enter the sides of the medulla. So what I now want to do is draw a picture of the medulla from the front. So we're now going to stand at the front here and look at the medulla from the front. And what I'm going to be able to show you is where the glossopharyngeal nerves and the vagus nerves are going to enter, or emerge if you prefer, from the medulla. Okay, so how am I going to do this? So I'll draw the medulla like so. So here it is. We're looking from the front, so the spinal cord would then be below here, but I'm not going to mark the spinal cord on. And then I want to show you some of the important landmarks that you'd see on the medulla. So firstly, at the front of the medulla you have two two strips running down the front, two sort of projections forward in the way that I'm drawing here. Okay, and I'll just make it slightly more obvious if it's not yet. So there are two sort of processes that project forward from the front of the medulla, like two sausages sitting on the front of it. They're part of the medulla, but they're just these sort of projections out the front. So if you were to feel the front of the medulla, you'd be able to feel these raised bits here. And these are what are known as the pyramids of the medulla, or the medullary pyramids, or the pyramidal tracts, if you like. So these are the pyramids. So this one specifically would then be the left pyramid, because remember we're looking from the front and this is patient's left, and this one would then be the right pyramid, and they are these projections out the front. Now what they represent is the corticospinal tracts, so all of the descending motor information that's under conscious control comes through these. So they are axons from neurons which have their cell bodies up in the cerebral cortex, in the primary motor cortex portion of the cerebral cortex, that are descending down to influence the activity of alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord, and they therefore control voluntary movement. So they're incredibly important. They are just these clusters or aggregate or lots of axons running in parallel. Tracks is a good word. So these are the pyramidal tracts or corticospinal tracts at the level of the medulla, because of course the corticospinal tracts have to descend all the way from the cerebral cortex, and the primary motor cortex is around here on the brain. They have to descend all the way through down into the level of the spinal cord where they're going to innervate alpha motor neurons. So they have to go through a lot of regions of the brain, and this is what you can see of them running through the medulla here. Okay, so they are landmarks on the front of the medulla then, the pyramidal tracts or the corticospinal tracts, whatever you want to call them. Okay, in addition, on the front of the medulla you have two more landmarks that I'll put here, which are the inferior olives. And again, these are sort of projections that you can feel with your fingers. So if you were feeling the front of the medulla, you feel the two pyramidal tracts, and then on either side of them, if you were near the top of the medulla, you'd be able to feel these inferior olives or inferior olivary nuclei, to give them their more fancy name. So you can either just call these the inferior olives in the same way that you can call these the pyramids, or you can call them the inferior olivary nuclei in the same way that you can call these the pyramidal tracts or the corticospinal tracts. So I'll just colour in the inferior olives here in blue, and again they are easily findable on the anterior surface of the medulla here, easily locatable just by feeling the front of the surface of the medulla. Okay, right. Now let me show you what you would see sort of at the back of the medulla here. So here's the medulla going round, and of course on top of here you'd have the pons, but I'm not showing that. At the back you'd sort of have projections backwards, which are the inferior cerebellar peduncles. So these sort of portions here, like so, and I'm just wondering what colour I'll colour these in. I'll have them in purple here. So these sort of bits at the back of the medulla here, these are what are known as the inferior cerebellar peduncles, and they are where fibres are going from the medulla into the cerebellum. So the cerebellum needs to be receiving a lot of information, for instance all the visual information that it needs to calibrate motor movements, and this information has to enter the cerebellum somewhere. It also needs to receive a huge amount of more information, like where all of the parts of the body are currently located. It needs to have a lot of proprioceptive information. It also needs knowledge of what the motor system is planning to do as the movement, so that it can see what needs to be corrected. It needs a huge amount of information to perform its role, and this information needs to come in at some point, and the inferior cerebellar peduncles here at the superior portion of the medulla are a means by which information can actually go into the cerebellum. So these are axons passing from the medulla into the cerebellum. So these are the inferior cerebellar peduncles, and they're coloured in there in pink, so I will underline their title here in pink. Okay, so this is a basic picture then of the medulla, looking at the different portions, and as I say, the pons would be sitting on top of here and the spinal cord would be down here. I might try and just add on the spinal cord, like so. Now, what else do I want to show you then with this picture? Well, what I want to show you with this picture is where the glossopharyngeal nerves and the vagus nerves are now going to enter the medulla, and it's in between the inferior olive and the inferior olives rather, and the inferior cerebellar peduncles. So in this space here, this lateral space on the side of the medulla, this is where you're going to get the glossopharyngeal nerves and the vagus nerves entering the brain. So I'll just draw this on the right hand side here. So here is one of them, and here's the other, and they go in beautifully next to each other. So the glossopharyngeal one is the one on top, so this is cranial nerve 9, and here is the vagus nerve. And of course the same will happen on the other side, and I might even just add it on there. So there's 9, and here is 10. So these are the two right cranial nerves, right glossopharyngeal nerve, right vagus nerve. This is the left glossopharyngeal and the left vagus. Okay, so I'll colour these in, not in red, because we've used red for the pyramids. So I'll have the glossopharyngeal nerve here in green, and then we'll have the vagus nerve in yellow here, like so. Okay, so that's if you were ever looking at a piece of medulla and you were seeing the little nerves coming out of it, these are the positions that the glossopharyngeal nerves and the vagus nerves would be in, and it's a common neuroanatomical class activity to try and identify the different cranial nerves coming out of the brainstem, and this is where you'd find 9 and 10, and they are visible, you can see them, they're big nerves, they're not tiny little things. Okay, right, so this is where the glossopharyngeal nerves and the vagus nerves enter the medulla. So the central processes then of our baroreceptive afferents are going to be going into the medulla, and what I now want to show you is which portion of the medulla they're actually going to go to, because they're going to go to a very famous nucleus inside the medulla. Remember, a nucleus is just a name for a collection of cell bodies within the central nervous system. So a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system in the peripheral nervous system. A nucleus is a collection of cell bodies in the central nervous system. So the central processes then of these baroreceptive afferents are going to go to a very famous nucleus, and I now want to show you that very famous nucleus. So we're going to draw an even more complicated picture of the medulla. Again, I'm going to draw a picture that neuroanatomical classes absolutely love, which is a cross-section, and they love these things because it involves histology. They can produce lovely slides of cross-sections of the medulla, and they can drill medical students on it. Okay, so I'm going to draw one of these cross-sections. So I'm going to draw a reasonably superior cross-section because, of course, look, 9 and 10 are coming in at a reasonably superior level of the medulla. And it is worth noting that if you take a cross-section, a transverse cross-section of the medulla lower down, it does look considerably different to if you take it superiorly, because, for instance, the inferior cerebellar peduncles, do not run the entire way down the medulla. They're just at the top. In addition, the inferior olives, they're just at the top as well. Okay, so we are taking a transverse cross-section of the superior portion of the medulla, and I want to show you all the different nuclei that we're going to need to understand. And let me just position this piece of paper, otherwise I would have been writing on a bit of paper that wasn't actually visible to the camera. Right, so let me draw the cerebellum, and just bear with me. So I'm going to draw firstly the outline, then we'll put on the things we know, like the pyramidal tracts, the inferior olives, the inferior cerebellar peduncles, and then I'll show you some new stuff, some of these fancy nuclei that are in the medulla that are going to be important for us to understand. So I'll start by having the right inferior cerebellar peduncle here, and then we've got the left inferior cerebellar peduncle here, and I'll try and do my best to make it roughly symmetrical. Then what we're going to have is the gap here where, of course, our 9th and 10th cranial nerves are going to be coming in there. Then we're going to have the forward bit where the inferior olive is going to be, like so, and then I'll put the pyramids, or the pyramidal tracts here, on the front. Okay, that looks reasonably symmetric. So let me firstly just put the pyramids on. So here, these are going to be the pyramidal tracts, and every time I say pyramid I'm thinking renal pyramid in my mind, but no, I must not say renal pyramid. So if I do say renal pyramid, do excuse me. The pyramidal tracts are here in red. Okay, and I won't relabel them up, I'll just make sure I get the colours correct. So here is the two pyramidal tracts. So this one, of course, is the right pyramidal tract, the left pyramidal tract. You could also call this the right corticospinal tract and the left corticospinal tract. Then we're going to have the inferior olives. Now, the inferior olive ivory nuclei actually extend further medially than you would believe if you were just looking at them from the outside. So they actually take up a lot of space. They're all of this region. And the inferior olivary nucleus, it has a very complicated function that I can't really describe to you without having to talk about loads of other stuff that I don't really want to have to talk about. It's involved well, actually, I can give you a one-liner. It's involved in motor learning in the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, I've told you about how it's incredibly involved in performing these incredibly calibrated movements, incredibly fine movements. How does the cerebellum learn to do that? Well, it learns to do that through a huge amount of experience, a huge amount of mistakes that it then learns from. So when you're a child, you're rubbish at catching balls, and that's because your cerebellum hasn't learned how to do it yet. Okay, so after mistake and failing to catch the ball enough times, your cerebellum gets better and better and better, and the inferior olive is very important in helping the cerebellum to teach itself how to calibrate movements to actually make them work. So it's incredibly involved in motor learning in the cerebellum in ways that we have models for, but the models, they are just that. They are models for what's happening, and we all accept that they're not the actual truth of what is occurring, and that we are going to have better models in the future. But they are very interesting models still. Okay, but they're not the subject of this video, so I won't say any more. And I think I've probably just... Oh no, I haven't broken the colour code. I did previously colour in the inferior olivary nuclei in blue. Okay, so there they are, the inferior olivary nuclei, and then we've got the inferior cerebellar peduncles right at the back here, which I previously had in pink, so I'll colour those in pink again. Okay, right, so now, why have I drawn this picture? Because I want to add some more information on. So remember, our glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves will be coming in on the side here, so I might just draw on them, and you can imagine it's either of them. Of course, it would depend which specific level we'd gone in at, which one I was seeing here, but let's say it's cranial nerve number 9. Okay, it doesn't really matter, it's just going to be there so that I can actually draw the baroreceptive afferent on in a moment. Okay, and I'll have that again coloured in green here. Okay, right. Now I want to show you some more detailed things on the medulla. Now, first I'm just going to put a few landmarks in. Some of these aren't going to actually be relevant to us, but are just background information. Okay, so there's a very important structure here that I can't honestly draw a section of the medulla and not put in, although it's not relevant to us. So if you know neuroanatomy, hopefully you should be screaming at your screen now what I'm about to say. These are the medial lemnisci, the medial lemniscus. So this one, of course, is the left medial lemniscus and the right medial lemniscus. These are the major ascending tracts. So I told you about the pyramidal tracts here. These are motor information descending from the cerebral cortex to command alpha motor neurons down in the spinal cord. These are the opposite. These are a huge amount of sensory information that's going to be brought to conscious awareness that is coming up. Okay, and is going up to the primary sensory cortex up in the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, and at this stage, these ascending tracts are known as the medial lemnisci, and I'll have to make sure I spell this correct. So the singular is medial lemniscus, so this will be the left medial lemniscus. The plural is medial lemnisci, so you take off the us and put an I there instead. Okay, so as I say, they're not relevant to us, but I can't honestly, credibly draw a picture of the medulla, this cross-section of the medulla, and not put the medial lemnisci on there. Okay, right, now some more relevant stuff to us then. So I want to show you some nuclei that are right at the back here, and the first two that I'm going to show you are just to put everything in perspective, but again, they're not actually relevant. So these two nuclei here that are right down at sort of the forefront of this projection inwards. These are the hypoglossal nuclei. They're the motor nuclei of cranial nerve number 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve. So these are the hypoglossal nuclei. The hypoglossal nerve, it also comes out from the medulla. It's a motor nerve, and it's going to innervate the muscles of the tongue. So when you move your tongue about, sticking your tongue out, moving it from side to side, all of those sort of things, that's the hypoglossal nerve doing it, and those are the tests that we do to make sure the hypoglossal nerve's okay. We get you to stick your tongue out, move it from side to side in a cranial nerve examination. Okay, this nucleus here is where the cell bodies of those motor neurons that are going to innervate the skeletal muscle cells within the muscles of the tongue are actually going to reside. Okay, so that's what the hypoglossal nuclei are, or rather where they are, in the medulla here. So of course you have a left one and a right one, which is these two here. Okay, now why have I shown you that? Well, because there's going to be a bunch of other important nuclei that are around those. So just to put them in their proper position relative to the hypoglossal nuclei, I've put the hypoglossal nuclei on. So now here are 4 more very important nuclei, and these ones are going to be relevant to us. So we'll start off with the ones that are just behind the hypoglossal nuclei, and everything's symmetric, so you've got 2 of everything here. What colour should I go for? I'll go for pink again. I don't have a great range of colours anymore, and a lot of the colours have run out. These nuclei then are just behind the hypoglossal nuclei. These are the dorsal vagal nuclei. Now these are not where cell bodies of sensory nerves are going to be contained. We've seen where the sensory cell bodies were contained. They were contained in those nodose ganglia in the case of the vagus nerve. But this is where motor neurons are going to have their cell bodies that are going to send their axons into the vagus nerve, and indeed parasympathetic, preganglionic parasympathetic nerves, which are going to put their axons into the vagus nerve to innervate, for instance, the heart. They're going to have some of their cell bodies in the dorsal vagal nucleus. So this is one that we're going to be interested in. This has cell bodies of preganglionic parasympathetic neurons in it. Okay, so this is the dorsal vagal nucleus, and again you have a left dorsal vagal nucleus and a right dorsal vagal nucleus. Everything is symmetric. Okay, and I'll use yellow, that's a colour I haven't actually used yet, for the ones behind now. So these 2 here. Now these are the nuclei where the central processes of the baroreceptive afferents are actually going to go. So I might actually even now draw on my central process going into this nucleus here. Okay, and now what are these nuclei called? Well, they are called an old name, an old Latin-y name. They are known as the NTS nuclei, and this stands for the nucleus of tractus solitarius, but then you don't put the of in, so it's just nucleus tractus solitarius. And this is translated now into a more modern name, which is the solitary tract nucleus, and it refers to the fact that it is solitary in some sense. Okay, but it's a nucleus in the medulla, which is going to play a very important role in this baroreceptive reflex. So this is the nucleus tractus solitarius, and this is where the baroreceptive afferents from our glossopharyngeal nerves and our vagus nerves are actually going to come. So you could have the same thing on this side, so these ones will be going into this left nucleus tractus solitarius. Okay, so the information is going to be delivered into neurons which will have their cell bodies in the nucleus tractus solitarius. Now, just to add in a little bit more before we move on, we have now seen the nucleus where all of the baroreceptive afferent information is going to come, but of course we want to see the control centres for sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous output to the heart and vascular smooth muscle cells. So we need to see more than just where the baroreceptive afferents are actually going to be sending their central processes. But we do now know where the information about mean arterial pressure is going. Another nucleus that I want to draw your attention to is in this sort of position, again bilaterally like so. So this nucleus is known as the nucleus ambiguous. And this also has cell bodies of preganglionic, parasympathetic neurons that are going to send their axons into the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve does carry a lot of parasympathetic axons that are going to go to the heart, for instance, and other places, but of course we're just interested in the heart. and this is a nucleus that is going to contain preganglionic parasympathetic neurons that are going to be going to the heart. So it's an important nucleus for us to know about. So this is the nucleus ambiguous, and now all of this sort of region in between, this white region that no one is ever going to really colour in and is just going to leave blank here, this is what's known as the medullary reticular formation. And it is important to know about this because this is where certain of our, well, in fact, both of our sympathetic control centres are going to be. The sympathetic control centre for sympathetic output to the heart, and also the sympathetic control centre for sympathetic output to the vascular smooth muscle cells. Those centres are going to lie in this reticular formation. So this is the medullary reticular formation, and it is important for you to put medullary in front of there because the reticular formation runs up the entire brainstem, so you do need to put the medullary there to point out that we're talking about the portion of the reticular formation in the medulla. So all of that white space behind where the nucleus ambiguous is and in front of where the inferior cerebellar peduncle and these important nuclei here are, this is known as the medullary reticular formation. And these centres for the control of sympathetic output to the heart and to the vascular smooth muscle cells, they're not going to be dense nuclei in the way that these are dense nuclei. They're going to be much more diffuse networks. All of the neurons involved in the control of sympathetic output to the heart and to the vascular smooth muscle cells, they're not going to be all clustered in one region. They're going to be much more spread out in this reticular formation area, and there's going to be lots of other neurons in between them which will be doing totally different functions. It's a much more diffuse network. Okay, so it's a little bit more complicated for you to understand that there isn't just one blob that does this, but it's in this region. Okay, so I think we'll have a break here. Familiarise yourself with this cross-section of the medulla, and in the next video what we'll do is we'll talk about the two sympathetic control centres for sympathetic output to the heart and to the vascular smooth muscle cells. We'll also talk about the parasympathetic control centres, which are much simpler to understand because they're just the nucleus ambiguous and the dorsal vagal nucleus, and then we'll talk about how the information coming into the nucleus tractus solitarius is going to influence these sympathetic and parasympathetic output systems to actually produce the desired response.